Robert Neubauer studies the media strategies of Canadian environmental and pro-resource extraction social movements with a focus on populist discourse and public mobilization around proposed energy infrastructure. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher and limited-term assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Victoria, where he teaches on contemporary media studies and climate politics. In this episode, Robert and I chat about how an effective communication strategy for rallying the public in support of climate action really needs to validate the public's concerns about things like affordability and healthcare, while also emphasizing the urgency of the climate crisis. The way we do that, he says, is to create an effective political container. I get the sense that the phrase "a big tent" applies here. I've been hearing from a lot of people that expanding the tent when it comes to transformative changes to infrastructure and to our lifestyles implies the need to communicate the everyday benefits of climate action, while also being realistic with audiences about the severity of the risks we face. If we fall short in our efforts to convince folks that a radical reset is required, so if we can't figure out a way to undermine the cultural importance of the automobile, for example, then we're in even more serious trouble than the science tells us we are. That's because a creeping fatalism is forcing a lot of people to court the idea that it's too late. Neubauer says that nihilism is potentially more dangerous than far-right populism here. He unpacks the idea of petropopulism, which is still a concept that I struggle with a bit. I find Neubauer's way of bringing this idea into conversation with the notion of cultural capital really helpful. Robert uses this famous idea from Pierre Bourdieu's work to talk about how petropopulism expresses itself and how it's secured such a prominent place culturally and politically in this moment. Neubauer gives us a way of critiquing the propaganda of petropopulists like Ezra Levant, whose ability to manipulate a sense of pride and feelings of national belonging have proven to be remarkably effective in Canada. In response to the pull of nostalgia, nationalism, easy answers, the left can't just focus on its standard techniques of shaming on the one hand and allyship on the other. Robert feels like these are now simplistic strategies that go nowhere. Resisting the stunting effects of facile forms of solidarity and public shaming is all about accepting real responsibility for the work of decolonization. The constraints of a carbon-intensive society make it hard to imagine any alternative to the way things are. But things are changing nonetheless. As companies with skin in the carbon game realize they need to aggressively rebrand fossil fuels as an integral part of our lives to maintain just the normalized status of oil and gas, the climate movement is positioning itself to counter with a totally different relationship to energy. I kind of wanted to start by gesturing to this really powerful piece that you wrote with several other sort of energy humanities folks, some pretty big names. The piece is called Communicating Power, Energy, Canada, and the Fields of Communication. That piece, so I kind of like to start with the general and the abstract. I don't know if that's counterintuitive, but I like that the piece says that our, quote, capacity to understand energy as both problem and possibility depends entirely on how we communicate about the capacities it affords, the damages it can cause, and our potential to shape the energy futures that lie ahead. So obviously there's a ton there to begin with, right? But when it comes to just like Canada, thinking about Canada, you've written that, so if we're thinking about, energy being bound up with these ideas and these identities, when it comes to Canada, you say the unifying signifier is Canadian energy, as though it's a thing that we can have this kind of, deep connection to. But there are a lot of problems with that, and I wondered if you could talk about the idea of Canadian energy a bit more and maybe offer some context on sort of how that relationship is formed between an energy regime and this kind of like nationalistic sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's kind of a research question that I've obviously been very interested in, and some of the other folks who had written that communicating power piece, like Shane Gunster and Imre Salmon, also very interested in. And I think there's a few different ways you can look at it, but maybe I'll start with saying, why we approached and why I've found that an interesting term to unpack, and it was very pragmatic in the sense that, I study industry, fossil fuel industry messaging and the messaging of kind of pro fossil fuel advocates pretty closely. And one thing that I noticed, and so did some of my colleagues, was just over the past, I'd say starting about 10 years ago, maybe it'll actually look longer, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago, started seeing that phrase and that term, Canadian energy, be used in industry communications, being used by advocacy groups, pro fossil fuel advocacy groups online, some of whom were directly industry funded, some of which seemed to be kind of arm's length. Some of whom seemed to be kind of arm's length, but when you looked a little closer, you realize they're actually pretty closely associated with industry. Though not all. I mean, so we wanted to kind of get a sense of like, well, where did this term come from? Because it's a potentially very powerful, signifier, right? And so on one hand, I mean, this was a very uh, calculated, essentially like public relations kind of campaign move by an industry that thought of itself as increasingly under attack by the early 2010s. The Canadian oil and gas industry and related industries are very used to getting what they want in terms of policy, in terms of projects. There are a few outliers like the Mackenzie gas pipeline in the north. That was a desired project that they never really got out of the approval process. But generally speaking, they were kind of used to getting the legislation that they wanted. They were used to getting their projects more or less rubber stamped. I think the idea that was in certainly industry's interest to get new projects. By new projects I mean maybe very new uh, uh, oil sands mines, tar sands mines, or especially since the early 2010s, the desire to build new pipeline and tanker transportation projects that could get in what was seen as an increasingly landlocked resource where our only customer was the United States, get it to China. Not just China, but China was the big one. The industry had plans to build pipelines to the East Coast, the South Coast of Texas, right? Like and the West Coast. But the West Coast was very much about getting these bitumen pipelines and later natural liquefied natural gas pipelines to carry product from the interior to the coast, and then from there to refineries in East Asia. Because anyone who's studied the political economy of Canada, not just in terms of energy, is that we're notorious for having a very extractivist model of development, right? Like we dig up the resource or we cut it down or whatever, and we ship it off. We often end up shipping it somewhere else to be processed, whether we're talking about softwood lumber in British Columbia or energy. And a big the industry found that these projects that were kind of traditionally uncontroversial in the broader public sphere, they weren't used to these projects being national controversies, right? And what they've started seeing was this very kind of these regional movements, increasingly of often local communities that were along project paths, like for instance, coastal communities in areas where they wanted to put oil tankers through, or a lot of indigenous communities along pipeline routes and along coastal transport networks. Local settler municipalities who would be feel like they were at potentially their economies or drinking water could be at risk if something spilled, um, that all of a sudden, these groups were increasingly allied with a more transnationally integrated climate action movement and climate justice movement, and all of a sudden, that these projects that I think industry was used to thinking of as very controversial, very uncontroversial, were they were getting tons of pressure in electoral campaigns to elect municipal and provincial governments to kind of put as many stops in these projects as possible, or all sorts of things. Indigenous legal challenges to some of these projects, and a lot of this resistance realized was that people looked at these projects, and the cost benefit analysis didn't really work out because the distribution of risk and reward that structures Canadian energy development. And now I'm using the industry's language. Canadian fossil fuel development, right, is extremely unequal, right? I mean, benefits tend to, especially when you're talking about transportation projects, there's not a lot of money in operating a pipeline, right? There's not a lot of jobs in operating a pipeline. There's jobs in constructing a pipeline, but a project like, let's say, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, originally developed by Kinder Morgan to get tar sands bitumen out to Burnaby, Vancouver, and ship it overseas, right? That's a project where those projects are designed to increase upstream demand for the product, right? The goal of a pipeline in British Columbia, if it's a bitumen pipeline, is to increase the amount of bitumen you can produce upstream in Alberta or Saskatchewan. Like that's the plan. And so, but a lot of the risks, like ecological risks, economic risks, risk to people's drinking water, came at the site of would come at the site of transportation further downstream, right? Like if there's a lot of the regions, like the let's say tar sands economy upstream in the prairies has quite a lot to gain, the companies there, relative to downstream communities that get a pretty small share of the economic development, but a huge amount of the ecological risk. And that applies doubly traditionally for First Nations and Indigenous communities, right? And there's other ways, right, that the distribution of a benefit is also oriented, and risk is also skewed along class lines, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, many regions of fossil fuel, many fossil fuel producing regions in Canada, but especially um, uh, the Alberta oil sands, tar sands. I kind of use the terms interchangeably. The rise of those industries aligned with the kind of neoliberal shift in governance that we saw a lot of provinces and federal governments make in the throughout the 80s and 1990s, right? So the royalty regime, even if you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan, right? Like the royalty regime is structured for unconventional fuel sources. It was often structured in a way um, to essentially give the product away, like almost for free, right? Like tax or have royalty rates that are extremely low, in order to incentivize more and more capital investment, right? And then the idea being that we'll gain a very small share of the resource rent in the form of taxation per barrel of oil, but we'll produce so much of it that if we just a double, triple, quadruple the amount that we're producing, then we'll get the tax revenue, and of course. That works pretty well until there's a crash, and like the government of Alberta finds out that even though
Right.
one of the most oil-rich places on the planet, it's having difficulty paying the bills and is running huge deficits every time the price of oil
Right.
goes down.
It's because, and that is in significant part because, like, admittedly, like, there's so much in what you just said. It's an incredibly detail oriented kind of understanding of the financial mechanisms that allow for this like interconnected infrastructure to proliferate. And sometimes, in many cases, in spite of the ecological damage, but also riding roughshod over like local cultural perspectives on the environment and what gets crassly called sustainability. Like, there's so much in what you just said. The thing that I kind of wanted to pick up on
Was
is
the
the sort
Canadian
of
energy piece?
what, yeah, the Canadian energy idea, like especially in relationship to Um, the idea that this is an industry that does require some mass mobilization for its defense in
Yes,
order to protect it
that's right.
from this
Yep.
perceived threat. This is an industry that, as you say, has become very used to getting what it wants, and yet now the posture is one of a victim that
Yeah.
like these environmentalists are out to get us, and really we just care about jobs. How does the evidence, how does the data undermine that idea? And how does the volatility of the market itself
Yeah.
kind of undermine that idea where like the
Yep.
bottom can just fall out of it economically? And
That's right.
then, what do you
Well,
do?
I think, and thanks for getting me to course correct. 'Cause I can go off at a bit of a tangent with these sorts of things, right? But kind of what I was getting to is that people were increasingly understanding that that the risk and benefits of this development were not evenly distributed.
Hmm.
And in a situation like that, like I always come back to there is a great piece of early writing by Ernesto Laclau, actually, when he's coming up with an early definition of populism in the 70s, and he was saying that like defining what is popular, like of the people, is very much this kind of linguistic class struggle where different groups with particular interests fight to be able to define their own interest as the interest of the collective, as the interest
Hmm.
of the people. And Canadian energy is exactly that. When it came to oil sands, LNG is a little bit different. When it came to the oil sands, if people in, for instance, British Columbia thought of this as an Albertan project that benefited multinational corporations um, at the expense of local coastal communities or British Columbian communities, if indigenous communities thought of that along the same lines, then this was were very difficult projects, and this is a very difficult industry to get consent for, right? It's
Hmm.
also a very capital intensive industry, which means that the
Right.
rate of employee like if you wanted to produce the largest number of jobs per dollar of public sector investment, actually oil and gas is and particularly unconventional oil and gas is not a great way to go about it, right?
No,
Like
yeah.
and in fact, after every crash, right, you tend to see more and more investment in labor saving technologies to prepare yourself for the next boom. So like
Yeah.
each round of expansion, talking just finding it as Canadian energy is I think a way of trying to smooth out all of those wrinkles in the public consciousness. They need to make it something that is a part of not just Canadian prosperity, but Canadian identity, right?
Hmm.
And the reality is also that I think they were very aware. The industry was very aware that for there were large sections of the country that oil and gas was already bound up with their identity, right? Like it's
Yeah.
very much bound up with people's identities in oil producing regions in the prairies. Same thing kind of occurred, I think, in Newfoundland to an extent with the unconventional offshore boom there. But what they sort of realized was that outside of those producing areas, people just didn't think about oil and gas very much. Like, it's almost uh, uh, I don't want to say a metaphor for the climate crisis, but it relates to our difficulty dealing with the climate crisis in general, right? Like the
Yeah.
energy that if you're not in a producing region, the energy that you consume, it's a little like Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, right? Like we're very much most people are separated at least, either geographically or just um, uh, or just don't interface with the
Hmm.
energy we consume on a daily basis. Most people don't think about um, most people don't think about their the daily activities they gain pleasure from that take or that they have to do to survive, drive to work, so on, and then and spend a lot of time thinking about the fuel source. So I
No,
think
yeah.
industry also realized that they could tap into the fact that if we are a country that a decent portion of the economy of certain regions are been based on extraction, And also we exist in um, as a kind of relatively affluent core country in as a Western core country in global capitalism that has been a model of development that has been very dependent on fossil fuel use throughout its history.
Hmm.
Um, that one of the best things that they could do was just constantly remind people of that fact. I think. And so
Yeah.
I think Canadian energy is a bit about, it really is about distracting people from um, the kind of real maldistribution, unfair distribution of risk and reward that structures the industry and in
Yeah.
general, but also to get people to start thinking about their national identity as something that is just very much dependent on this one very particular fuel source, which is somewhat interesting when you think about it, because you know, like prairie identity is not historically dependent on fossil fuel use. Right, that's a relatively recent economic
Right.
phenomenon. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like you see this profound, passionate attachment, but it's definitely historically contingent, and it needs, like your research shows, that it needs to be reaffirmed, reassured. It needs to be constantly kind of like tapped into. And there's a kind of, a double nature to that, where, like, yes, there are ways in which it is obviously this kind of manipulative, nefarious thing that Seth Klein says, like, let's just ban the ads,
Yeah.
just let's take away the possibility of this corporate propaganda convincing people that oil and gas are our lifeblood and the backbone of our economy. um, it is, there is a passionate attachment. It is historically contingent, and I do think that, like, the work that the energy humanities, and especially in Canada, where there does seem to be this kind of like insurgent, academic at least, discourse that wants to dismantle extractivism in solidarity with frontline and fence line communities. Like, it's about sort of trying to develop a vocabulary for seeing these tactics deployed, and gauging their effects. And I, like, for example, I really like the essay "Our Oil" that you wrote, that appears in Regime of Obstruction, a really important book that people should look at. The essay is particularly insightful on, yeah, like, just the power of these campaigns to maintain the status quo. And so it's here that you describe extractive populism as just that, an attempt to say that it's actually oil and gas and the petro-modern lifestyle that are fundamentally under attack. Our oil, ethical oil, Canadian energy, like, these are powerful symbols, but they're not crucially, like, these, you say, like, monolithic or invulnerable symbols, right? Like, when you talk about the right leading a popular mobilization to defend, and as a democratic expression of the public will to fight for an industry that serves the public good, you're saying that that is basically a form of mass deception.
Yeah.
um, and the problem is really that it's just very effective. And I guess I wanted to kind of unpack why it's effective and where we can see cracks in the edifice of kind of like oil and gas's social license, and whether we can drill down into that concept of social license a little bit as something that both sides, as it were, like to deploy for their own ends.
I think so. In terms of why these things are effective, I think there's a few different ways you can put that under the microscope, and I think different scholars, different activists, writers have touched on different things. Some of which we don't touch on too much in that R oil piece. Um, but so one element that's been getting a little bit more traction recently, and I've been taking maybe a little bit more seriously over the last few years, as you've seen this kind of discourse kind of metastasize and move from a very industry um, funded and planned discourse to almost an article of faith in broader right populism in Canada. Like if you see these sorts of arguments about petropopulism anymore online, in some ways the industry's even stepped back, and a lot of it's just being done by a broader kind of conservative alternative information apparatus online that doesn't necessarily have industry funding. And I think part of that is some people have argued that um, there's a material connection between the type of world that fossil fuels made possible, and I'm using world in almost maybe like a sociological sense, um, and the identities of particular actors whose identities felt very stable in that world, right? So people have noted, for instance, that regardless of the propaganda efforts of industry, men seem to be much more susceptible to both climate change denial and extractive populism than women. That's not meant to be a generalization, like women are immune, all men fall for it, but statistically speaking, it does tend to be a pretty empirically robust result when people look at this. Uh, Also, uh, there is does seem to be a particular, white men in particular seem to be very susceptible to this type of discourse. The petro-populist discourse is twofold, right? It's that oil and gas is what maintains the good life, but defined maybe as my freedom or my prosperity or just my way of life. And the second part of that is there are these liberal elites. I would say in the metastasizing version, I would go with globalist elites in the last few years who want to take that all away, and they're the bureaucrats that want to increase your taxes, the activists that don't work in the real economy, which usually when you hear that, you understand what they mean as a capitalist market economy. Part of the reason I think I study the right so much is that they're just some of them are just really, really clever with rhetoric, and their communication strategies. And imagine trying to convince a section of the population that Davos and the World Economic Forum is a left wing conspiracy that's designed to destroy capitalism, and then force scared liberals to defend the World Economic Forum in order to undermine the right wing conspiratorial version of it. It's ingenious. It's brilliant. I wish I had come up with that idea, for
Yeah, it's a
my team.
strong idea.
And I think like the organized right has become extremely good in the last 10 years of trying to maneuver. I want to say liberals in particular, more so than leftists, but a lot of liberals who've had to feeling kind of hopeless, throwing their lot in with leftists, throwing their lot in with liberals to get people to disavow things that they shouldn't be disavowing. But I think that beyond beyond the kind of material underpinnings of, let's say, like one of the reasons why I think petropopulism and climate change. People have argued climate change now. Why that can appeal more to men than women is that in especially in North America, men have traditionally had a lot of their identities of masculinity and even authority around the traditional households bound up with automobility, cars. Right, Matt Huber has done great work on that. So there are kind of real ways in which energy use and oil and gas use has grounded people's kind of cultural identities and sense of self and sense of the good life. But I also think it's very powerful because petropopulism as a rhetorical gambit is very popular for a few other reasons too, right? Or powerful for a few other reasons. First off, I I don't think ideology is very good at convincing people that are getting screwed that they're not being screwed. Right? I think ideology is very good at trying to create a particular partial interpretation of why you're getting screwed. We do live in a society in which leaving aside more in depth some more in-depth critiques of the notion of populism, like we do live in a society that is divided between a relatively affluent and politically influential elites and a bunch of people that don't have that sort of juice, right? That have to just work day to day. Like we do live in a world in which aspects of the environmental movement have been oriented around this. Naomi Klein, in her excellent book about 2017 or whenever it was, maybe a little later than that, "This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate," is like, yeah, there is a version of environmentalism that is more oriented around uh, highly educated middle class people that don't necessarily, didn't necessarily have as its fundamental interest until the rise of environmental justice movements in the last few decades. Like what would happen to working people that depended on livelihoods associated with these industries. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger really does get off his jet and lecture people in Alberta and BC, about why they need to shut down the industry to lower their carbon footprints, right? Like, when I teach environmental communications courses, I always say, like, look, the one thing if you're ever working for a movement is just like that is an organization that is fighting for climate justice is you just got to tell Leonardo DiCaprio to stay at home, right? Like
Yeah.
this guy's not doing you any favors, even if he's well-meaning.
There's
Um,
a problem for sure in regarding fame as a force and not
yeah,
understanding its contradictions. Like fame is undeniably a force. The problem is that it's deeply compromised and it becomes a tool, as you say, for kind of giving people a partial explanation for why they're screwed, especially in the long term, why they're screwed. And I do feel like part of the thing that you're trying to do is to figure out a theory of power in relation to energy. Like I see you working toward this when you write about cultural capital, especially.
yeah,
It just kind of comes in because I think you want a term that's sort of more broadly applicable than social license in some ways,
yeah,
right? Like the notion of cultural capital is deep and diffuse, and it accounts for the way that petroculture kind of reproduces itself every day,
yeah,
despite our knowledge that we need to stop. We
yeah,
need to stop
absolutely.
carbon infrastructure, even in the face of the economic impacts, right, of global energy prices shifting. We need to find a language
Yeah,
that allows us to kind of override those crass market logics. And cultural capital seems to be this occasionally very compromised way through a lot of these impasses or the
yeah,
stuckness that people write about. But it does have limits as well, right? And
yeah,
that's the Leonardo DiCaprio problem.
yeah. Well,
Um,
the thing I like
yeah.
about the concept of cultural capital, which is, of course, Pierre Bourdieu's concept. But what I found so interesting about his ideas was like, well, if you just look at them a little differently, like cultural capital, you realize it's actually a really good tool for trying to understand how hegemonic politics actually operates, right? Like
Mhm.
people with influence and power, economic capital in one field want to influence other fields. Like if you have a lot of money in the business field, you have a lot of economic capital. Uh, you know, uh, it gives you certain types of resources to try to amass cultural capital, for instance, of expertise by funding a think tank and having them be able to influence the media field or government policy field or so on. But what I like about the concept is it's so relative. And like right now there's kind of multiple types of cultural capital at play in these kind of political struggles. And it was like I started becoming interested in how ideas become considered valid in particular spaces. And that
Mhm.
led me to, when I started doing my graduate school work, I was, looking into especially the climate stuff and other issues. You started, just was so fascinated by the phenomenon of these kind of very elite connected think tanks, right? Like
Yeah.
organizations that produced research and there's a lot of great think tanks out there, and there's I think think tanks on different sides of the political spectrum that are more or less um, serious about research. But a lot of stuff I was looking at, like the Fraser Institute, big oil funded neoliberal think tank that has been a leading force in climate denial and obstructionism for decades. You know, uh, Fraser Institute doesn't really like Fraser Institute produces research, but what they're really doing is producing public relations material in the guise of research, right?
Yeah.
You create your experiment or your study parameters in order to get the results that you want so that you can communicate it to CBC or the National Post
Right.
or a politician. And so that's this cultural capital of expertise. And on one hand, I think in green movements that you do need to counter it with for you with your own expertise. First off, like climate change denial, it's like you need to counter bogus science disinformation with the findings of actual experts. Like that's really important. Um,
Mhm.
Uh,
And hopefully they're convincing and kind of charismatic
Hopefully they're
that can
convincing and kind of
overwhelm.
charismatic, and that's not always what they're trained to do,
No,
and what they want to do as scientists.
for sure.
But there's other forms of cultural capital too, that as I saw populism become, on both the left and the right, become such a more and more of a potent political force. You realize, oh, there's also this cultural capital of a representative popular, right? The
Hmm.
cultural capital, not of being one of the elite experts that can tell you what the problem is and how to solve it, but the cultural capital of being able to present yourself as just like one of the average Joe, right? As the
Hmm.
person that, again, like Leclau said, speaks for the people on their behalf because they're one of the people. It's so strange how being identified as an expert can be such an advantage. That cultural capital could be such an advantage in some contexts, and yet in
Hmm.
other contexts starts to become, almost seems like a liability,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't,
Yeah.
and I think the right has a much easier job, and industry has a much easier job, because at the end of the day, they don't need to convince people to envision a radically different way of life or another world. It's what
Of course.
it's what
Yeah.
Gramsci would have called, used to call, or uh, uh, a passive revolution, right? He didn't mean passive as in non-violent, because he thought of 1930s European fascism as a passive revolution. But what he meant by that was that Mussolini, Hitler, so on, they didn't need to replace capitalism with something else. They needed to organize and popularize another form of capitalism to get through the crisis of the Great Depression and a variety of other related crises. And so their
Mm.
job was just a lot uh, easier, right, than
Right.
the socialist job, who needed to be able to plausibly explain how to build something radically different, and not kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
try to
Yeah.
get back to this sort of a reorganized version of a mythical past. Um,
Right, and to get in bed with that, like to
yeah,
dwell in that mythical past, which provides such simple answers for sure.
like what what is um, Pierre Poilievre right now campaigning on, other than to bring back the way it was,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
And what makes it, what's so difficult for the left right now, and and in the environmental movement right now, I think, is the need. It's like, oh, it's much harder to put forward a coherent, actionable vision and a near term strategy for building something new when we know we have to. And climate
yeah,
change makes it clear that we have to.
I
Right?
know, and I actually have talked on this podcast with a number of people recently about sort of like basically theories of change. Like, what's a liberal theory of change? What's a conservative theory of change? What's a radical theory of change? What are our basic assumptions about the capacity of human beings for change? And I think like we'd like to pretend like we don't have to worry about that. That's so complicated, and yet it seems to be really kind of at the core of a lot of what we're fighting for. Is like a more kind of decentralized form of expertise that is more about credibility or authenticity that can draw from sort of like this deep well of a sense of belonging. There's a citation in one of your articles. I think it might be in Our Oil, but I'm not sure. Where you talk about Nick Nanos, a public opinion survey that Nanos ran in 2016, where he asked just this question: "What makes you proud to be a Canadian?" And the top response, given by just over a quarter of respondents, was equality, equity, and social justice. So there's some kind of kernel of progressive values that is there. That's
Yeah.
part of like core Canadian national identity. What seems to be happening is so much economic precarity and fear of instability is leading to this moment where the Polyev promise of some return to a forever fugitive past is seemingly winning out over that kind of more difficult commitment to social justice.
Mm.
Is that your sense of where Canadian politics are at right now? And how do you diagnose the deeper causes? I guess, like, is it about the erosion of media that's often cited, or Is it really about the economics of energy at a moment where, like, you still have fossil fuels made artificially cheap?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I always like just the thought of like, oh, how do these different pieces fit together? Like, how does the media piece fit together with the maybe more concrete political ecology of energy in our lives? I think we've ended up in a bit of a deconstructive cul-de-sac on the left in Canada. There can be a bit of a over focus on elements of the discursive,
Mm,
where especially in academia, but also increasingly in activists and online spaces, like people get very excited to like deconstruct
mm,
Canada and the notion of Canada, and like, well, look, here are all these things we convinced ourselves it was, but look at the shameful reality of our history. A lot of our history and present reality is very shameful. I think this is intensified by the obvious elephant in the room, which is Canada as a settler colonial state. And so much of our notion of what Canada, like this progressive notion of what Canada was, that was very much associated. I always associate it very much with uh, Trudeau liberalism, like Trudeau the First, that period of liberal hegemony that was very much about defining Canada as, at least in part, as multicultural, committed to international law. Maybe we're not like Norway, but we've got more of a welfare state than the United States, and equality is important to us, and so on. And in a sense, I do feel like there's a lot of elements of the left and liberalism that there's this form of like wallowing in this kind of guilt of recognition of what Canada is. And factually speaking, like I don't really have any real critiques of that. Like, yeah, you're right. Like you're right. Like this is a colonial state. The 60s scoop was brutal. We continue to orient resource policy in order to gain access to indigenous territory so we can build what we want when we want. All of that is true, but also it's like there's two things at work. One, I find it very interesting that the Canadian right has mobilized and actually they've created a new master signifier, larger than Canadian energy. It's just the notion of pride, right? The most popular group in the most popular right wing advocacy group online in Canada, and no, not right wing advocacy. The most popular advocacy, political advocacy group online in Canada is like Canada Proud and the network of Proud groups, right? The Manning Center, which runs some of the Proud groups, the others are run by Jeff Bellingle, a CPC communications pundit staffer. Um, the Manning Center has changed its name to what Canada Strong and Free. I think by far the most powerful, by far the most. And this is sad for me to say this as a leftist uh, communications media scholar. By far the most prominent alternative media organization in Canada. It's not the National Observer, not even close. It's not the Tyee, not even close. It's not the Narwhal, close. And I love all those people. I love all those organizations. I think they've done a lot of great work. It's True North News, which is like a watered down version of Rebel. Well, okay, True North, Strong and Free, Canada Proud, BC Proud, Alberta Proud. It's a little bit, it's like that passive revolution concept again. The right doesn't have any problem of being proud of a mythical Canada, and in fact, many of the things that leftists condemn Canada for are things they're proud of. So, at the level of the kind of organic intellectuals of those movements, I suspect that the things that Jeff Ballingle or Ezra Levant at Rebel Media love about Canada are probably things I don't love, right? And yet, at the same time, like shame is not a very productive political emotion. And like responsibility, like a feeling of responsibility, I think is different than being paralyzed with shame or guilt, right? You can recognize your complicity in something and feel a responsibility to make it better. But I think when
mhm.
people are racked with shame, they go for cognitive dissonance, they go
Yeah.
for belief disconfirmation. And a big issue for us now, it seems to be that, like, I'll say something that's also particularly controversial. And this is based on my time in the last this is based on my time living in Vancouver for about 20 years, writing my dissertation on and being somewhat plugged in to a lot of the blockadia networks fighting against the environmentalists, fighting against those pipelines, where the alliance between indigenous communities and mostly settler-run municipalities and activist groups was very, very strong.
Hmm.
But over time, I started thinking that like there was an element of the kind of, let's say, settler environmental left that um like like being allied with indigenous communities, there's an element to which it's like we don't have to think about how we would change this country or even create a new state apparatus in its place, because we just sort of let indigenous nations and communities think about that for us. Like we abdicate our responsibility to think through, like, okay, like, what would a decolonial Canada even look like? Like, what would our
Right.
responsibility be to concretely think what our governance structures would be, how they would relate to Indigenous governance structures?
Hmm.
Um, what type of economy do we have a responsibility to envision and build that wouldn't require constant brutalization and subjugation of Indigenous peoples to get access to
Right.
it? And what I noticed in Blockadia, which was Naomi Klein's concept for the kind of regional but internationally linked
Hmm.
movements to stop particular pipeline projects, oil sands, mines, that sort of thing, was that there was not really a vision. But if you went to indigenous communities that were fighting those pipelines, they often had a vision for their nation. You know what I mean? Like, we don't
Sure.
want to do this. We want to replace this activity with this activity, or
Yeah.
we want to run our territory in this way. I didn't get the impression that there was any of that happening in like
Right.
Burnaby, the probably the settler center of the fight against Trans Mountain, like,
Yeah.
because like there's a very uncomfortable reality that most Canadian leftists don't want to deal with, which is that like for all of our deconstructive talk and all of our decolonial talk, it's like none of us have any plans on going anywhere,
Right.
right? And if we don't have plans on going anywhere, like we actually have to think about like like what like what do we want to envision where we live to be, and what sort of ethical commitments do we have should have um, the people whose territory we just took and built our
Yeah.
cities and built our communities on. That's a very painful, difficult, and frightening conversation.
Yeah.
But if you can convince yourself that someone else is going to do it for you, right? Like,
Right, or
you
that
know,
you can just use terms like relationality
yeah,
or the non-human world, which I used in this conversation, or cosmology, like invoking terms like
yeah,
imagine otherwise or indigenous cosmologies. Like I do think that there is, you're right, a way in which we're, which is by the we here, I mean like white settler,
yeah,
not just academics, but like eco-socialists, let's say, are not necessarily dwelling with the entanglements of energy because they're able to kind of point to this other way of envisioning relations, yes, with nature, but that is not theirs, and they're kind of claiming it
yeah.
a little bit
That's right.
as their own in a lot
Yeah,
of these environmentalist discourses.
I think that's absolutely right, and I don't think it's coming from a bad place. I don't think it's coming
No.
like I've done a lot of that myself, but it took me a while to just be like, maybe like if we were really serious about being like allies, to use the term, we would need to get serious about what we want to replace this system with,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is a place where that was a very long digression, but I think that plays a big role into why petropopulism has been so popular, because we don't on the left, eco-socialists, environmentalists, there isn't a very strong there hasn't been a very strong vision of what we're going to build in its place.
Hmm.
But like we do very much need an alternative political vision to the one
Hmm.
that's being sold. And in the absence of that, I think in a time of instability and crisis and the epistemological shit show that is social media and our contemporary media system, I think the populist right has a real advantage because
Hmm.
again, their revolution is a passive revolution. They don't need to
And it's
sell.
like super, super well resourced. That should be said.
Oh yes,
Like
that is really
we're
important.
so
They've got
outmatched in terms of just dollars we can devote to
yeah,
communication.
yeah, they've got. I think what they've, but that's an interesting question because I think what they've done, and when I say they, I'm talking about this sprawling network of rapidly growing conservative alternative media in Canada, but in other places as well.
Yeah, I
These
wondered if
these
you could talk about Cenovus and Enbridge in particular as kind of like spearheading a lot of these
Oh
strategies.
yeah, I think one way those two companies in particular, if I'm getting at what you're getting at is like I said, one major aspect of petropopulism, one let's say discursive plank in the idea is that um, we are all reliant, like it's not just oil and gas workers, we are all reliant on fossil fuels in our daily consumption habits, and that's what creates the good life for us, and also but also just it's just what enables us to go about our daily lives, right? And um Enbridge and Synovus, I think they responded, and Enbridge notably the company trying to build the first of the pipeline tanker projects, with the exception maybe of Energy East, that really got this intense regional opposition that was freaking out the industry, Northern Gateway. um, Enbridge and Synovus started a new advertising campaign. One thing that there was a period where the first thought was like, okay, to um, to get over environmental opposition to our product, we need to try to counter the claim. Like we need to claim that okay, no, we're lowering our carbon footprint. We're putting buffalo reserves on top of old oil sands mines and that sort of stuff. That's still a very big part of the messaging, but a new strategy became connecting fossil fuel consumption to the products and activities you consumed or did on a daily basis. And that way you would get people to feel, on one hand, you would make it easier to say something like Canadian energy is what runs this country, because
Hmm.
instead of just thinking about, oh, here's the employment statistics, or here's the community where people, it's like, oh, like that's hey, the shoes you're wearing, they're made from petroleum products. Like, oh, the IV that they put in you at the hospital when you're intubated with COVID, it's made from petroleum, and so on. They really started pushing this idea of selling branding their product to consumers, which had never really been done before. I don't mean like Petro Canada's like, oh hey, our oil and gas is we got a good unleaded blend or something like. I mean like
Right.
the idea of oil and gas and coal itself. And so Enbridge created this fabulous, I mean quite insidious, but from a rhetorical perspective, fabulous
Hmm. Hmm.
advertising campaign called Life Takes Energy,
Mm.
in which they started very savvy. They didn't show oil and gas wells or old oil sands sites or anything like that. They would do something like there'd be like piano music going, and there'd be like a nice a father who's preparing, baking a cake for his daughter's 12th birthday, and the voiceover would be like from Enbridge, we didn't come up with the recipe to make her favorite birthday cake, and we didn't drive her to her dance recital or so on, but we're the ones that created the energy that made your birthday celebration with your daughter possible, right? And they do another one with someone driving their kids and their dog to the beach, and another one with them. We didn't book the ticket to Aruba that allowed you to get quality time with your kids, but we did fuel the plane that took you, that sort of thing. Life takes energy. Synovus had a very similar campaign called More Than Fuel. But same idea, right? And the idea became, it was really, I used those ads to my students in classes, especially in environmental communications classes, and it was so interesting because on one hand, on the surface, it's a very uplifting and positive ad. You could say that, you could argue that these sorts of ads make you feel empowered because of what energy does. But when I asked my students how it made them feel, they said it made them feel powerless, right? It made them feel
Wow.
hopeless, because,
Yeah.
and I, it kind of light bulb went on. I talked it out with my students. I said, look, here's what I think is going on. That is very clever of them. When you take oil and gas, when oil and gas is understood in the realm of politics,
Mhm.
industry is scared,
Mhm.
and people feel like they can do something. Like we haven't done enough, but the Blockadia movement did stop the Enrich pipeline. It did stop, in many ways, Energy East. They made it a lot more difficult to get Keystone through, but a lot of that had to do with the movements in the states, and so on. It looks like they are going to get Kinder Morgan through. But that means that out of like the five major pipeline projects that the Harper government tried getting through as of 2012, like they're getting one, maybe two of them. That's still
Mhm.
way more than we can survive.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
not acceptable if our goal is to mitigate, to stop or even mitigate climate disintegration. But from the industry's perspective, that wasn't a good 10 years. But when you take things from the realm of, if you take oil and gas transition, energy transition, from the realm of politics and bring it to the realm of consumption, all of a sudden people feel powerless because people start thinking about, what are my consumption options today? Like,
Mhm.
how do I get to work tomorrow?
Right.
If I, how do I enjoy my hobbies? How do I put food on the table? Like
Mhm.
what are the energy inputs that are being put into, right? Like at the level of policy, and policy can, you know, ban certain inputs into production. It can tax. Not that the carbon tax has turned out to be a great political maneuver for the environmental left, but like, we can tax certain products and subsidize others. We can vote to build new infrastructure, right?
Mhm.
Clean energy infrastructure, public transportation. If you build a feeling of citizenship and community empowerment that I actually think Blockadia was very good at, um, you can really get people feeling powerful and impactful and not hopeless. But
Mhm.
if you move things from the realm of political organizing and even state policy to the realm of the supermarket, the irony of the way capitalist consumerist ideology works is that it tells us that it's in the marketplace, not political organizing or the state or policy or whatever. It's in the marketplace that we can truly exercise our freedom and make a difference in our own lives and maybe make a difference in the world. Oh, I'm going to buy the fair trade coffee, right? Instead
Mhm.
of the
Mhm.
instead of the agribusiness coffee, right? But the actual reality is, it's in many ways the exact opposite about the things that really matter, right?
Right.
Like, it's actually in the world of consumption, our choices are profoundly, and our options are profoundly limited.
Right.
And most people, most people aren't billionaires, so they're and millionaires, so the less money you have, the more limited your options are. So in a
Absolutely.
way, like that energy life world discourse. Hey, look at your shoes are made of oil. The food on your table produced with petroleum inputs. You drive to work every day. You're using oil and so on. Um, like that is such a that on one hand that can fuel this kind of hardcore reactionary petro-populist. Oil and gas fuels your identity and your world,
Your
and these
life
these elites want to take it away from
fuels
you.
your life.
It fuels your
Yeah.
life. But what's beautiful about, again, just talking about its strategical
Mhm.
acumen, what's beautiful about that maneuver is that it also fuels non-populist discourses of like energy defeatism, climate defeatism, right?
Mhm.
This sort of like, there's tons of people that are not swayed by petropopulism in a hardline way, who increasingly, my Gen Z students are like this,
Mhm.
who just sort of feel I believe the phrase is, they become black pilled. That I think is, some ways, as or more dangerous than the petropopulism, because
Mhm.
it can create a sort of a situation in which, even if you don't buy into the notion that Canada is this glorious nation where our good life is dependent on fossil fuels, and producing and consuming fossil fuels is what it means to be Canadian. And the globalist elites are in league with Leonardo DiCaprio and a well-spoken neurodivergent girl from Scandinavia to sabotage the entire system and force us to eat the bugs.
And apparently Taylor Swift
Is in on it. She's got a private jet, but again, these celebrities are terrible for us, right? You don't want anyone with a private jet talking to you about your carbon emissions, and the environmental movement should reject any of that help. Right. But like celebrities are very useful when it comes to pointing attention to issues that are not understood as political or power issues, right? If Leonardo DiCaprio wanted to sell you a particular brand of toothpaste, no, you wouldn't care. There's nothing political about your brand of toothpaste. Once it's about distribution of material, political, economic power, then someone's status as a genuine member of an economic and cultural elite becomes more concerning, right? Or at least it's something that can be exploited. They can judo flip it on you, right? But you don't need to be one of these petropopulists in order to just be like, well, what are we going to do? Especially if the horizons of possibility are understood as business as usual, but with a different energy input. People like Naomi Klein were dead on. What she was arguing was even with its total mystification and just straight up insanity around denying scientific reality, climate change denial, denying the importance of climate change, pretending that climate change was a hoax, even that aspect of the right at least correctly understood that fossil fuels were totally bound up with capitalism as usual, with the way our nation states operated, with the way that our daily lived experience and consumption habits have developed over the past 2 centuries. And yet, there was actually something less realistic about the problem, about the people who were like, these were kind of the, these were the, maybe I'll call them the global male environmentalists or something, right? Like this idea that, oh yeah, you know what? Like post energy transition, it's going to be just like the world we have now, but with electric cars, right? Well, no,
yeah, and I don't think that resonates. I do think that you're right that like there's more potential impact to a bolder vision because there is so much disillusionment with the kind of like incrementalism. Now is the moment where all of this political will just naturally be freed up, right? Because we've reached this kind of like social tipping point when it comes to making those links clear for people. But I think like we don't want to declare victory prematurely. And I think your work is pointing out that this kind of resurgent denialism is precisely the kind of like, surface level effect of a deeper belief that level of complex system change is just not something we're like wired even to do. Like the nature of the market is that we've come to expect convenience and the blandishments of a consumer lifestyle, and that it will always be political suicide to pitch anything resembling degrowth or central planning for the purpose of like a wartime mobilization to fight climate change. All of that stuff, non-starters. Well, operating from that basic assumption means you can't articulate a bolder vision. You've just like stunted the growth of any like radical solar punk future or whatever.
Well, it also like I think I have some sympathy for those concerns in the sense that like we're in a bit of a pickle here, and we feel like we need change very very quickly, and it's and then also there's just this sort of feeling that radical change will be very hard to sell. And also, like I said, like the time scale of the problem is as such where it's like, I think you could even make an argument like, yeah, what we needed to be doing was having these very honest conversations over the last 30 years. And now the problem is so bad that the transition would need to be so fast that
Hmm.
all of a sudden things that even could have felt more plausible then all of a sudden feel like luxuries now.
Right.
But I think ultimately the problem is that that type of thinking can lead to its own magical thinking where you stop
Yeah.
paying
Yeah.
attention to the materiality of the problem, right?
Hmm.
So the question then becomes, okay, so we can't advocate for these radical changes. Like, will the piecemeal changes you're advocating for work,
Yeah.
right? The other aspect is that, and I think this is a kind of contemporary, like what Mark Fisher called it, like kind of capitalist realist ideology in which capitalism and even just our current form of it feels so unchangeable after,
Hmm.
right, the disaster of Soviet communism and also
Yeah.
just kind of retrenchment of the new left in the West with the neoliberal transition and so on. That it becomes a bit of a, like people start thinking, well, I guess this is what we're stuck with. We got to operate within these parameters,
Hmm.
and yet you end up with these very unrealistic assumptions. Think of the fact that so many of the brightest, best minds in the more mainstream elements of the environmental movement, government, the think tank world, and so on, especially in the kind of centrist think tank space, thought to themselves, well, the best possible thing we can do is just to tax carbon and then just keep raising the price of carbon until market forces do their work, as though people wouldn't vote them out, right? Like that, like if you didn't like that if you didn't build, like if you didn't come up with a plan for like a national build out of retrofits, making it so that people can live close to where they work, like you didn't start thinking about how the housing system was going to function, like if you didn't have a plan for building out convenient and attractive public transit, maybe I'm kind of blown away. I'm sure there's engineers that can explain to me why this is naive, but I'm still blown away by the fact that we have like like you have like what we own Bombardier. We have no fast rail in this country, even linking up the major population centers in Quebec and Ontario. It's insanity, right? And then we're just like, no, we're just gonna keep upping the price of gas every year, and there'll be no political repercussions. We'll totally get from A to Z.
It's as though you want it to fail, right? Like
Yeah,
it's this is what George Mobio said about like COP28. It's as though it is designed to fail.
yeah, for sure.
These mechanisms,
And,
right?
and maybe they were like, Donald Gutstein wrote a great book about kind of the growth of kind of clean capitalism or climate capitalism policy frameworks in Canada. But he points out the fact that the carbon tax that's now being attacked as this radical imposition. This was a corporate creation. This was the light
Yeah.
touch solution that industry, in particular, the largest, most concentrated segments of the fossil fuel industry, so-called Big Five, were comfortable with. Like they
Hmm.
produced that. The conference board had a part in developing this, right? CD Howe in them. Well, I shouldn't start just naming think tanks at random because I should check my math, but because I can't remember exactly which groups he pointed out in his book. But it was it's like these very corporate influenced policy planning networks were the ones to come up with um, the carbon tax. And I think the most sensible explanation for that is they weren't afraid of a carbon tax in the way they were afraid of
Sure.
other more radical policy interventions.
Like just abolishing their product.
Yeah, and I think
That kind of thing.
and we're in a really bad situation now because it um like there's a kind of lack of attention to historical capitalist dynamics as well. Like the second and to a certain extent we have a bit of an act of God at play as well, because no one could have seen, well, maybe some epidemiologists will disagree, but like no one could have seen COVID coming, right? And when it
Mm.
came and so on. Well, that played the shutdown combined with a variety of other factors, including a kind of I mean, this is outside my expertise, but my impression is probably a few decades of loose monetary policy that kind of neo Keynesians kind of claimed could just go on forever without any impact. These kind of supply and demand side factors came together in this historical moment to produce the worst inflation we've seen in 30 years.
Hmm.
Um, my understanding is that my impression of looking at the at history is that inflation tends to benefit the right and capitalists,
Yeah.
and crises of demand-based crises like stagnation crises, unemployment, recessions tend to benefit the left a little more because
Mm-hmm.
you can devise even within capitalist political economy, you can devise ways to boost demand, right? Stimulus
Hmm.
spending and so on, right? And that sort of thing, right? And even the quantitative easing, right after
Hmm.
the financial crisis, uh, they're
Hmm.
using all these um, uh, weird fiscal and monetary tricks to like pump more money in the economy without actually like spending a lot of trying not to actually do a lot of state spending
Hmm.
which was going to freak out financial markets in a kind of neoliberal post austerity environment
Hmm. Hmm.
um
Hmm.
and also like you couldn't lower interest rates anymore after 2008 because they've been keeping interest rates artificially low for 15 years in order to keep the Clinton years running, leading to bubble after bubble, right? The tech bubble. That's one of the reasons why Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg run the world today is because of those low
Hmm.
interest rate environment. That's the whole other sort of
That's right.
story,
Yeah.
right? And so you end up in this situation like now that this is the chickens have kind of come home to roost. Like, man, does anyone feel good about selling a carbon tax in the context of 5 years of inflation and COVID crash and like I'm
It's a
not
worst
claiming
case scenario,
the worst
and it,
case scenario,
yeah,
the
it really
worst case.
makes selling the kind of transformation required a struggle. But I think, yeah, it doesn't change the urgency of it. Like there is this discourse of it's not too late, like trying to use this kind of mobilizing rhetoric of it's not too late to get us out of a certain kind of conceptual place that you've already articulated that people occupy, which is that we are so constrained by an economic system that has been densified in terms of the financial ability to kind of produce virtual wealth that we're just like we're trapped, right? We're trapped in this reality. I think that engaging with that in good faith is valuable, like just
Sure.
saying like you do feel like it's too late, and I concede the point that there is all kinds of evidence that it is actually too late.
Yeah.
We've crossed many of the tipping points, the planetary tipping
Yeah.
points already. We don't want to acknowledge it, but trying to like meet people where they are, which is in a place of grief and that
Yeah.
powerlessness that your students
Yeah.
describe, is useful for the left and for left populists as such, because it allows you, I think, to say, I see you, but I also don't accept that defeatism. Because if you're accepting that defeatism, then you're kind of like conceding the future, right, to these extractive forces, and that's just not. You use the term climate disintegration. There are all these terms that we use: climate emergency, climate crisis, climate instability, climate breakdown, climate now disintegration. We don't want to get into what you earlier described as a deconstructive cul-de-sac in trying to kind of chart the trajectory of a growing urgency of rhetoric. But even that itself is a way of, I think, trying to kind of like build out conception of what people are feeling right now, which is
Yeah.
this enormous weight and a feeling that it is too late.
I've always been a fan of well, it's a Gramscian, Gramsci's classic quote, right? He was a pessimist of the intellect and an optimist of the will, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and admittedly, it didn't work out too good for him because he he's stuck in Mussolini's prison and so on. But there is, I think, an element of I think for we're not really in a position where we can convincingly BS people about how bad the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
So there probably is, and also I feel like there's an element of when you're I'm sure uh, my rhetoric colleagues will consider this kind of a silly statement or naive, but one thing, something I wonder if the key to good rhetorical persuasion too, it's almost a little like what they say it takes to be like a good member of an improv troupe, right? It's like you never
Mm-hmm.
say no, you've got yes and right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you've got to validate people's concerns and also the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
um but I think there's also like 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 there are still, even though I say there was a type of like climate Pollyanna ish, like
Mm-hmm.
a thing that actually in the end was very damaging to us in the present moment. There is also still a place to, to uh, put forward some more not optimistic scenarios in terms of what climate change is going to do, but in terms of the type of society and future we can build, right? Like to a certain extent, again, I think one reason why petropopulism has been so powerful as both an ideological force, as a discursive phenomenon in both legacy and new media, digital media spaces, and as an electoral kind of platform, is that we haven't had too many we need to still be good, I think, at explaining things that you could have that you would actually really like. Like think about something like on one hand, like think about one of the newest planks in the anti-globalist right populist conspiracy, which has incorporated petropopulist narratives in conspiracies, is like this idea of like 15-minute cities, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
like some scheme again by Davos and Klaus Schwab at WEF. One reason why it's easy to rile people up against 15-minute cities is like you're talking to a bunch of people in the suburbs who, yeah, it's totally true, as the energy humanities people like Matt Hubert notes, how important automobility, right,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, has been to informing like the good life in North American suburbs. But also, no one's uh, people who've lived in a 15-minute city or a 15-minute neighborhood. You try to sell that to them, and they're just like, "Are you insane?" Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I've lived in 15-minute cities, right, and then I moved to Winnipeg.
Yeah.
For a job. Winnipeg is not a 15-minute city. And there's so many people here like who would genuinely love a meaningful public transit system that
Yeah.
allowed them to leave the car at home a little bit longer, that would genuinely be excited about a transit model that connected their suburban home to downtown, where people tend to work in the suburbs. Winnipeg's got a real sprawl problem. The mayor literally ran an election on, I don't think this was his only campaign slogan, but he ran on saying that Winnipeg's a car city, and so we're going to fix the roads, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there wasn't really anything on offer from the other team to say how we're going to change that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you can make, like, okay, how long would it really, what resources would it really take? How long would it really take to create viable public transit at the level of both municipalities and regional transportation?
Mm-hmm.
What would really benefit you? Like people in Winnipeg, like a lot of people in the prairies and a lot of Canadians in general, right? Like they travel south on vacation in the brutal cold.
Mm-hmm.
But also you want to travel south. It's not just the weather. As someone I only lived here 4 years, so I think again my colleagues and people might think I don't know what I'm talking about. But it's also like there's very little public space, enjoyable public space in Winnipeg. right? Like if you're not in, like it is not been developed as a place where you would not want to take a trip from.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
it's like
Yeah.
you live like this. Communities are oriented around cars. Um, Commercial centers are structured like strip malls, and I don't get the impression that they were 40 years ago.
Hmm.
Like you've got a lot of main roads are indistinguishable from highways. Like there's not many neighborhoods in the city where you would leave your house,
Right.
get on your bike, and then 20 minutes later you're in
Just
a
doesn't even feel safe.
doesn't even
Like I
feel
think in a lot,
safe.
yeah, the idea in Halifax has been with our climate plan, you know, doing it for the purpose of trying to create a more vibrant and connected
Yeah,
community. You know,
yeah,
like that. It's not. It's Ali Rojo from Environmental Defense explained this to me recently. Like sometimes I think we need to remind people we're not just attacking fossil fuels because we
yes,
like hate them. It's not just like a personality thing that we're just like anti fossil fuels, like we're wearing that like a badge. It is like science based and out of concern for the future. And it's not just this Trojan horse way of like getting more bike infrastructure or something.
yeah,
It is like it is part of a kind of total vision that is ecologically rational, and you know just kind of insisting on that and pitching big moves on the basis of that fundamental fact that it's not actually just about like fossil fuels as a wedge issue.
yeah, yeah.
It's actually about like survival.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Can be valuable.
Yeah, and then maybe you can start trying to communicate to people, where have there been successful experiments to
Yeah.
produce a more sustainable but also vibrant community space, or a different way of creating your housing stock,
Hmm.
and your transit system, and all of that. On one hand, yeah, we need a viable vision that on one hand can be emotional and cultural and spiritual, but also needs some kind of at least some policy goals other than tweaking market behaviors by getting people to pay more on their gas bill every 2 years. And instead, so we need like an idea of like what are some actual things, like if we can't solve this whole problem overnight, but what are some actual things we could do that would that are going to require big public investments, and they're going to involve planning, not necessarily you won't all necessarily be central planning. This is not about necessarily the Politburo, right? But it's that or actually changing our housing stock,
Hmm.
improving our zoning and the way that we're building our communities around suburban sprawl instead of density. Our transit, like there are absolute, like we need a not just a kind of a political vision, but like a vision of what our politics is in a very pragmatic way. But also we need one
Hmm.
thing that the environmental movement and the left doesn't really have in Canada at the moment, unfortunately, is a meaningful electoral vehicle for it. We don't really have a place in which some kind of pragmatic but necessarily sweeping policy proposal has really been championed at the electoral level in a meaningful way. Like,
No. Yeah.
and that itself is very demobilizing. If you are attracted to petro-populist discourse, you have a whole bunch of places that you can put your votes, your political organizing time, at the party level, or whatever. The groups that we increasingly look at, these right-wing petro-populist, one thing that's so interesting is that they've turned their discourse has become very radical, very influenced by the alt-right, very
Mm.
influenced by petro-populist industry campaigns and think tank campaigns and so on, and astroturf groups and all that. But their political communication is very pragmatic. It's like they're not slamming Pierre for not being right enough.
Sure.
They promote their candidates constantly. They promote their party apparatus. Like they're very comfortable, and the Canadian right in particular is very good at taking over conservative parties and moving them to the right,
Hmm.
often through a long term plan to split the vote with a splinter party and then make the center right unelectable and then create a merger that's actually a hostile takeover. That's how the PCs got taken over by the Alliance, turned into the CPC. That's how Wild Rose basically undermined and blocked the political viability of the Alberta PCs, so that they could force a merger on the Wild Rose Party's terms. And Jason Kenney was supposed to be the guy to keep those two pieces together. And then he ended up being not radical enough during COVID, right? And now the inmates are in charge of the asylum, right, at that level. But throughout all of that, the right is not disenchanted with big P politics and democratic organizing, and they're very much not disenchanted with the notion of using the state to get what they want.
No.
And I don't know it. I think to a certain extent, I mean, even just a meaningful campaign to have a plausible electoral container to pour these aspirations in and champion these policies. There's no magical discursive trick for that, but that strikes me will probably be necessary, because otherwise we don't really have a place to put our energy in. That's not when it comes to something other than blocking a project we don't like.
Yeah, I think that creating that strong political container could genuinely be transformative, and it's not something that we have.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good kind of image to keep suspended, sort of, right? But yeah, I just want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Thanks for inviting me. You put together a really great podcast with some pretty exciting episodes and all sorts of interesting scholars and thinkers and policy entrepreneurs like Seth Klein, and so it was just a real it was a real pleasure to get to be a part of it.